In the early 1900s, a storm was brewing. The old world was coming to an end, and a new era was about to be born. Nations would rise against nations, kingdoms against kingdoms, and the world would be dragged kicking and screaming into a new age. Religion was still the main source of comfort for most people, and if you were alive at the time, it would have felt as though the apocalypse was truly upon you. In the First World War, there was so much religious fervour on both sides, so much propaganda and so much belief that God was fighting on one side or the other. But by the end of the war, people had largely lost their faith as a result of realising just how much their governments used that faith to get them to enlist and be sent off to the meat grinder. For those men in the trenches, surrounded by misery and death, it must have felt that God had abandoned them. Or if he'd ever been there at all. In the final book of the Bible, Revelation chapter 6, it is prophesied that the arrival of 4 horsemen will usher in the end of days, with cataclysmic consequences for anyone alive at the time. These 4 horsemen of the apocalypse are known as the White Horse of Conquest, the Red Horse of War, the Black Horse of Famine, and the Pale Horse of Plague. And in the years leading up to 1914, it would seem that the first of them had already begun to ride. Chapter 1. The White Horse of Conquest. Upon the opening of the 7 seals, one of the 4 living creatures spoke in a voice like thunder. And as I watched, a rider on a white horse emerged, holding a bow. He was given a crown and told to go forth and conquer. Around the turn of the 20th century, Europe was becoming a powder keg, and conquest was in the air, and it was feeling like all that was needed was a match to set the whole thing off. Germany had only recently been unified under the political genius of Otto von Bismarck. But by the time Kaiser Wilhelm II took the throne, the game had changed. Germany had arrived late to the colonial party. Britain and France had already carved up most of the world, and the rest was already spoken for. So, abandoning Bismarck's careful diplomacy, the Kaiser adopted a more aggressive foreign policy, known as Weltpolitik, world politics. And he believed Germany deserved her place in the sun. And this meant 2 things: overseas colonies, especially in Africa, and a navy to rival that of the British empires. And no doubt that would of course get the Brits' backs up. In 1889, Britain formally adopted the Naval Defence Act, declaring the Royal Navy must be at least as strong as the next 2 largest navies combined. And at the time that meant France and Russia. Maintaining dominance at sea wasn't just a strategy for this island nation, it was survival. The rise of the German fleet under Admiral Tirpitz sparked a full-blown naval arms race. Dreadnoughts thundering off the slipways in a contest that felt less like a competition and more like a countdown to war. Meanwhile, Germany found herself increasingly encircled. France, bitter from the loss of Alsace-Lorraine in 1871 during the Franco-Prussian Wars, formed an alliance with Russia, tightening that noose. Britain eventually joined this triple entente, leaving Germany boxed in by land and sea. Now across the map, imperial appetites stirred. In the east, the once mighty Ottoman Empire, the so-called sick man of Europe at this time, was slowly dying. And the vultures were already circling, drawing up plans to divide its lands before the body was even cold. Then there were the Balkans, Europe's actual powder keg. Bismarck prophetically said back in 1888, "One day the great European war will come out of some damn foolish event in the Balkans." And he was to be proven right. In 1908, Austria-Hungary annexed Bosnia-Herzegovina, inflaming tensions with Serbia, a small but fiercely nationalistic Slavic kingdom. And it would be here, in this volatile corner of Europe, that the spark would finally strike. On June 28, 1914, a 19-year-old Serb nationalist named Gavrilo Princip stepped out of a Sarajevo side street and pulled the trigger, assassinating Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne. This would set off a chain reaction that would draw in the entire globe into what would become known as the First World War. Conquest had kicked in the door, and now it was time for the Red Horse of War to ride forth. Chapter 2. The Red Horse of War. As the second seal was opened, I heard the second living creature say, "Come." And another horse went out, fiery red this time. Its rider was given permission to take away peace from the earth, so that people would kill one another. To him was given a great sword. The war that erupted in 1914 began with an intensity unlike anything the world had ever seen. Even the Second World War had a bit of a ramp-up period before the casualty figures started to climb. But here, in just the first few weeks, the killing was already on an industrial scale. New and untested weapons, like modern artillery and the machine gun, met with 19th century military tactics, and the results were catastrophic. The French, for example, went marching off to war looking not that dissimilar to what Napoleon's army would have looked like back in the early 1800s. Their cuirassiers had bright red trousers and feathered hats, looking more like bloody peacocks than soldiers. They did look impressive in their military garb, but they might as well have had targets on their backs. A machine gunner's dream. The French alone suffered 300,000 casualties in the first month of war. 27,000 men fell in a single day at the Battle of the Frontiers. It would take a couple of months before men would think to go to ground and dig themselves some trenches in order to get some cover from all that lead flying up above the surface. And as the body count rose at unimaginable speed, the great powers threw in their best troops to try and win a quick, early victory. But by 1915, Winston Churchill would write, "Men lost control of the war, and forces took over." In his book, The World Crisis, he described how the conflict slipped beyond human hands, driven by its own terrible momentum. The Red Horse of War had ridden forth and now seized the reins of nations. Now quoting from Churchill, "The year 1915 was fated to be disastrous to the cause of the Allies, and to that of the whole world. By the mistakes of 1914, the opportunity was lost of confining the conflagration within limits, which though enormous were not uncontrolled. And thereafter the fire roared on till it burnt itself out. Thereafter events passed largely outside the scope of conscious choice. Governments and individuals conformed to the rhythm of tragedy, and swayed and staggered forth in helpless violence, slaughtering and squandering on an ever-increasing scale, till injuries were wrought to the structure of human society which a century will not efface, and which may conceivably prove fatal to the present civilization. But in January 1915, the terrific affair was still not unmanageable. It could have been grasped in human hands and brought to rest in righteous and fruitful victory, before the world was exhausted, before nations were broken, before empires were shattered to pieces, and before Europe was ruined." End quote. The Red Horse was now in full flight. Peace was gone, ripped from the earth, and men were killing each other in numbers the world had never imagined. Nations weren't being led by strategy anymore. This was now a battle of attrition that would end empires and reshape the globe. An unquenchable fire that would roar on for 4 more years until it had burnt itself out in late 1918. Chapter 3. The Black Horse of Famine. As the third seal was opened, I heard the third living creature say, "Come." And as I watched, the black horse emerged. Its rider held a pair of scales in its hands and was sent forth to bring famine upon the earth. During this time of strife, the black horse roamed throughout the lands, one of the places most devastated by famine, and an atrocity often overlooked in the history books was the Persian famine of 1917 to 1919. Persia, today known as Iran, was officially neutral in the First World War, yet found herself hemmed in by hostile powers. Russia to the north, Britain to the southeast, and the Ottoman Empire to the west. Economically weak and politically unstable before the war, Persia was vulnerable to colonial pressure. Some nationalist factions, hoping to break free from the British and Russian influence, looked to Germany for support. But the government maintained an official policy of neutrality. That neutrality was violated almost immediately within the first 3 months of the war's outbreak. British, Russian, and Ottoman forces had all invaded Persian territory. Military occupation, crop requisitions for the war effort, and disruption of transport devastated the economy. Imports of food dwindled, prices soared, and by 1917, a vicious drought compounded the crisis. In some areas, particularly under British control, grain was diverted to feed troops or withheld from civilian markets. Some historians argue that this was no accident, but a deliberate policy to weaken Persia and tighten imperial control. The toll was staggering. Between 1 and 2 million people perished from starvation and the diseases that followed, roughly 1/5 to 1/4 of the entire population. In the book The Great Famine and Genocide in Persia, 1917 to 1919, Muhammad Ghuli Majid goes further. Drawing on contemporary reports, he claims the death toll may have reached as high as 10 million, and squarely points the blame at the British. In his account, this was not mere negligence, but an imperial crime later buried under decades of historical sanitization to hide the scale of greed. Now to the west of Persia, the dying 600-year-old empire of the once mighty Ottomans, the Black Horse left its mark once more. From 1915 to 1919, famine swept across the Levant. In Palestine and Syria, it brought hardship, but in Mount Lebanon, it struck with unparalleled ferocity. A French-led Allied naval blockade of the eastern Mediterranean prevented imports by sea, while Ottoman authorities seeking to punish the majority Christian population of Mount Lebanon and suspected pro-Allied sympathizers imposed an overland blockade that choked off supplies from the Syrian interior. The Maronite leadership had long-standing ties to France, and the Ottoman war minister at the time, Enver Pasha, one of the empire's ruling 3 pashas, and a hardline nationalist, viewed these Christians as a dangerous internal threat that might aid the enemy from within. In 1915, a plague of locusts descended, devouring much of that year's crops, and what little grain remained was often requisitioned by the military for the war effort. Starvation soon reached catastrophic levels. Families survived on grass, weeds, and animal fodder. In some towns, famine graves filled faster than they could be dug. Contemporary accounts describe streets lined with the emaciated, too weak to stand, and entire villages reduced to begging. Relief efforts were sporadic and often blocked by military authorities. By the war's end, between 500,000 and 1 million people across the Ottoman territories had died from famine and the diseases that followed. In Mount Lebanon alone, as many as 200,000 perished, roughly a third, and by some estimates, nearly half of her population. One other notable place where the Black Horse was to ride during this time was of course the German home front. When the war broke out in 1914, Germany expected a short, decisive conflict. Instead, it found itself in a grinding siege, not only on the battlefronts, but at the home front as well. The British Royal Navy moved swiftly and imposed a naval blockade, cutting Germany off from overseas trade. And by 1916, shortages were biting hard, and the winter of 1916 to 17 became known as the infamous turnip winter, when the potato harvest failed and the population was left to subsist on animal fodder. Malnutrition weakened millions, and diseases like influenza, tuberculosis, and dysentery spread easily throughout the undernourished communities. The blockade continued even after the armistice of November 1918, as Allied leaders used it to pressure Germany into signing the Treaty of Versailles. By the time it was finally lifted in mid-1919, between 400,000 and 750,000 German civilians had died as a direct result of hunger and hunger-related diseases. With the world already reeling from hunger and slaughter, they were about to meet the last rider whose death toll would dwarf all of the others combined. The Pale Horse was about to loose one of the most devastating events in human history. Chapter 4: The Pale Rider. As the fourth seal was opened, the fourth living creature spoke. And as I looked, there was a pale horse, whose rider's name was Death. And Hades followed along behind him. They were given authority over a quarter of the earth to kill with plague. In 1918, religion was the main source of comfort, and parents were used to surviving only some of their children. People regarded death very differently. It was a regular visitor. They were less afraid. This then was the world into which the Spanish flu erupted. A world that knew the motor car, but was more comfortable with the mule. They believed in quantum theory, and particles that blinked in and out of existence, as well as old superstitions, where spirits did much the same.
You're right, Mr. Morgan.
It was a time in history that straddled the modern and pre-modern eras. So some people lived in skyscrapers and used telephones, while others lived much as their ancestors had in the Middle Ages. But there was nothing modern about the plague that was about to be unleashed upon them, however. It was thoroughly ancient. From the first fatality, it was as if the entire population of the globe, some 1.8 billion people at the time, had been transported back several millennia. It is often said that the First World War killed romanticism and faith in progress. But if science facilitated industrial-scale slaughter in the form of war, it also failed to prevent it in the form of the Spanish flu. The flu resculpted human populations more radically than anything since the Black Death in the middle 14th century. It influenced the course of the First World War and arguably contributed to the Second. Wars often bring epidemics in their wake. Conflict makes people hungry and anxious. It uproots them, packs them into unsanitary camps, and requisitions their doctors. It makes them vulnerable to infection, and then it sets large numbers of them into motion, so that they can carry that infection to new places. In every conflict of the 18th and 19th centuries, more lives were lost to diseases than battlefield injuries. It created panic in the European theatre of war, where it interfered significantly with military operations. Following Russia's humiliating signing of Brest-Litovsk, as a result of which the Eastern Front ceased to exist, General Erich Ludendorff, the architect of the German war effort, tried to preempt the arrival of American troops in 1917 by launching a tremendous offensive on the one remaining major front, the Western Front. He saw this Kaiserschlacht, or Kaiser's Battle, as Germany's last chance of victory, and he had the newly liberated divisions from the east at his disposal. Despite initial successes, however, the offensive ultimately failed. Both sides were weakened by flu. As many as 3/4 of French troops fell sick that spring, and more than half of the British force. Whole units were paralysed, and makeshift military hospitals were bursting at their canvas seams. On the German side, up to 900,000 men were out of action. Inside the chest at autopsy, scientists found red swollen lungs that were congested with hemorrhaged blood, and whose surfaces were covered in a watery pink lava. The flu's victims died by drowning, submerged in their own fluids. The most terrifying thing about it, however, is it would arrive like a thief in the night. The most characteristic thing about the flu is the period of high infectivity that precedes the onset of symptoms. It's a cheeky little trick to replicate itself before taking out the host. For at least a day, a person may appear to be well, but they are highly infectious. In 1918, if you saw a comrade or family member with a cough or fall down, there was already a good chance that you yourself were infected too. It became apparent very early on that besides the elderly and the very young, it had a predilection for those in the prime of life, people in their 20s and 30s, especially men, who had already been fighting and dying in horrific numbers during the Great War. The peak age of death was 28, which meant that this disease was felling the pillars of families and cutting the hearts out of communities. In my own family, it has only been recently that I've been able to piece back together my family tree. As the parents of my grandfather, a decorated World War II veteran from Wellington, New Zealand, had both passed away from the Spanish flu not long after his birth. He was raised by other relatives and only found out late in life who his parents actually were. It's so sad to put yourself in the shoes of his parents, who would both die within 10 days of each other, leaving behind 3 very young children. But that kind of grief wasn't rare in 1918. Death was everywhere. I often look back on these earlier generations with an admiration of just how tough they were and how they pressed on through such trauma. If I was to lose one of my children, I couldn't comprehend how I would be able to continue on with life. But for many people from around this time, and especially before this period, it was common to only have a few of your children make it all the way to adulthood. Everyone must have been so traumatized. Either that, or they were a hell of a lot tougher than we are now, where the word trauma often gets thrown around willy-nilly. I think the sanitization of death in our society can leave us ill-equipped for life. We don't really live with 3 generations under the same roof anymore, where our young ones would witness the death of our elders and learn that death is simply just a part of life. Now we shuffle our old into homes, out of sight and out of mind, as if we can evade that final chapter of the life cycle. But by hiding death, we cut ourselves off from its lessons, and that absence makes us more fragile and less ready for what life will inevitably throw at us. I think it is wise to keep our elders around so that we can learn the lessons of the past, as those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. The Four Horsemen wait at the edges of history, silent but saddled. And if we are foolish enough to repeat the mistakes of the last century with the weapons we have today, the end of days might be a lot closer at hand than we would like to think.